Pioneer Girl, Chapter 6. Nothing happened on the way, and the road looked all the same. At noon, we stopped, fed the horses, and ate the cold lunch we had brought from the hotel, then went on again. It was after dark when we got to the camp, but Aunt Docia had a good warm supper waiting for us. Jean and Lena were two cousins I had never seen before. Lena was a very pretty girl about my age, with black eyes and black curly hair. Jean was very dark too, a little younger than Lena. There was room in Aunt Docia's shanty for all except Jean and Lena and me. Jean went to stay in the bunkhouse with the men, and Lena and I slept on a quilt on the ground in a tent. It was all very strange and rather unpleasant. If I had been up in the wagon, I wouldn't have minded. But I didn't like to sleep on the ground where there might be snakes and bugs, and I was away from Pa and Ma and the girls in a strange country. It didn't seem as though I ought to mind any of these things, but taken all together, I felt lonesome. Just as I was dropping off to sleep, there was a scratching on the tent by our heads, and a screech almost in our ears. It gave me a frightful start, but Lena shouted, "Hey!" It wasn't brought up in the woods to be scared by an owl. "It's Jean trying to scare us," she said, and I was asleep at once, so I went to sleep too. We didn't stay long at this place. The camp was already breaking up and going farther west to the next camp, for the grade was finished here, and a town called Brookins started. Aunt Docia's family and Pa were staying for a final acceptance of the work and settlement with the railroad company. I understood, and Aunt Docia and Uncle Hi were bitterly disappointed, for after their hard summer's work with themselves and four big teams, they were coming out behind in debt to the railroad company, for the price they were paid for making the grade would not cover the expense of building it, allowing nothing for the work of themselves and teams. On the contract of the camp ahead, they hoped to pay what they owed the company and make a little for themselves. Besides the big workhorses, Uncle Hi had two black ponies, one for Lena and one for Jean. These were on the picket ropes near the camp. Jean loaned me his pony, and I rode around with Lena a little. But I was timid, for I had never ridden a horse. Lena could leap on her pony from the ground and ride it bareback on the run. She and Jean raced each other from the ground, trying which could sooner mount and reach a certain place. Lena and I drove both ponies hitched to a light wagon several miles into the country to bring home the washing a farmer's wife had done for us all. It would be hard to tell which enjoyed it most, the ponies or Lena and I. They ran most of the way with their long black manes and tails blowing in the wind while we shouted and sang. When we slowed the ponies down to rest, they were quiet only a few minutes, then would touch noses and break into a run of their own accord. We found the reason the washwoman had not brought the washing back was because her daughter had just been married and she had been busy with the wedding. "She is only 13," she said proudly, "but it is just as well to be married young." The bride was my age and a year younger than Lena. As we talked about it going back, we were glad we were not in her place, but could run around and play as we were doing. We decided we didn't mind helping with the work and the babies, but as for us, let someone else be responsible. The next day, Aunt Docia's folks moved on to the new camp, but we had to wait another day for Pa to be checked out of the company store. Then, very early in the morning, we put all of our things in the big wagon. Pa hitched on the big team, and we went on west. Almost at once, we drove through the breaks along the river. crossed the Sioux River, and were out on the broad prairie and looked like a big meadow as far as we could see in every direction. There was no cover on the wagon, for we were going only 40 miles, and the sky was clear and cloudless. The weather was warm, but not too warm, and the wind was blowing, waving the tall prairie grass, and had turned brown in the summer sun. At noon we stopped, fed the horses, and ate our lunch quite in the old way, then hitched up again and went on mile after mile, never seeing a house or any sign of people. The trail we were following showing only broken and bent down grass to mark it. There were old buffalo paths worn deep in the ground, but grassed over and round depressions of perhaps a quarter or a half an acre that had once been buffalo wallows, but where now also the grass was growing. Late in the afternoon, a man on horseback showed on the prairie behind us and followed, gaining a little, and so drawing nearer as we went on. Paul seemed uneasy and kept glancing back. The man on the white horse overtook the other and came on. Ma didn't like their coming, but Pa said the last man was Big Jerry, and everything was all right. When they overtook us, the first man went on, but Jerry rode beside the wagon and talked to Pa. He was very tall, broad man, but not a bit fat, very dark with high cheekbones, a large nose, and straight black hair. He wore no hat. His shirt was a flaming red one, and he rode his snow-white pony without a saddle or a bridle, guiding it with his knees. In a few minutes he touched his pony with his heel, and away it went with the smoothest, prettiest run down into a little draw up on the other side and away. Ma was afraid they might wait for us in some draw to rob us, but Pa said Jerry was perfectly safe. He didn't like the looks of the other fellow, but Jerry had promised to keep up with him. Jerry, Pa said, was a half-breed Indian and a gambler, some said, a horse thief, but a darn good fellow. For some time the sky had been full of flocks of wild ducks and shaped flocks of wild geese, the leader of flying at the point of the and calling on his flock to follow. They always answered him all along the lines, and their air was full of their honk, honk. They were flying low, too low, and the rest for the night on the chain of the little lakes not far to the west of us. The sun sank lower and lower until, looking like a hall of pulsing liquid light, it sank gloriously in the clouds of crimson and silver. Cold purple shadows rose in the cast, crept slowly around the horizon, then gathered above in depth and on depth of darkness from which the stars swung low and bright. The winds, which all day had blown strongly, dropped low with the sun and went whispering among the tall grasses, where the earth lay breathing softly under the summer night, falling softly over the prairie and tucking them gently in. When we drove on and under the stars, and the last saw the twinkling lights of the camp ahead, when tired and hungry, we stopped before the largest shanty. Cousin Charlie Quinner came out to meet us and lifted us down from the high wagon. Cousin Charlie, whom had not seen us since we left Wisconsin, not soon long ago. He was a man now, and Cousin Louisa was inside dishing us up hot supper. She kept the cook's shanty and boarded all the men who did not have their families with them. After supper, we went to the new shanty the men had built for us, spread the beds on the floor, and slept soundly until morning. The camp was awake and stirring early after the men had gone to their work. We went to breakfast and the cook's shanty. It had been a pleasant surprise to find Louisa and Charlie, and we were glad we were to have them in the camp with us. The shanties were in a scattered group on the north bank of the lake. Silver Lake was only about a half a mile each way 160 acres, but the water was clear and cool. It lay in its little basin with a high bank on the south. On the north, the bank was low but firm and dry, while at the west end, the big slough began and extended in a curve southward. At the east end, the bank was very low, and from it another slough extended east and north. In these sloughs, the thick slough grass grew 5 and 6 feet high. The rest of it, the rest of the way around the lake, the upland prairie grass grew thickly. There were no trees. The only tree in the sight from all the surrounding country was a giant cottonwood called Lone Tree, which could be seen for miles across the prairie. It grew between the twin lakes, Henry and Thompson. Lake Henry was the nearest 3 miles to the southeast. Lake Thompson was beyond Lake Henry, with only a narrow tongue of land between, high enough not to be overflowed, but only wide enough for a good road, with scattered choke cherry trees and wild grape vines on each side, close to the water. 9 miles northwest of Silver Lake was Spirit Lake, with an old Indian mound on its bank. There were quite a good many trees at Spirit Lake, but they were only large, and the breast of the prairie swelled gradually to a higher level between, so they not only be seen from the line of the railroad. Lake Thompson was the largest of the group. Spirit Lake was the next in size, and water was deep, and the banks high and rocky except for the slough on one side. Wild gray geese, ducks, and many kinds, from the large mallard to the teal down to the mud hens, and the little hell divers, pelicans, swans, herons, sandhill cranes, gulls, and different kinds of queer little water birds, stopped at this chain of lakes going south ahead of the winter. The sky was filled with flocks of them, resounding with their cries, and any time we could see them rising from or settling down on the lake or on the prairie, they fed in the sloughs during the day, but slept on the water through the night. It was very pleasant when we were comfortably settled in the new shanty, with the great new country clean and fresh around us. I was so happy to be out in that I never gave thought of regret to the Walnut Grove, where settlers Pa said were getting too thick. None of us were lonesome or homesick. Our shanty was just one large room, but Ma got some calico from the company store, and we made curtains of it to shut off each bed by itself in the far end. Cousin Louisa, with Charlie to help her, was busy all day long cooking and serving food to the men. Aunt Docia's shanty was not far from ours, and Lena and I were together some. Always we did the milking together at night and morning. The cows were on picket ropes at one side of the camp, where the grass was good. We always sang as we went and came, and while milking, the cows became familiar with the wind blew across. The wild moor missed McLeod's reel, the Gimpsies' warning by a broom. She was only a bird in a gilded cage. Where what has my little dog gone, and many others. Pa's helper Fred, who slept in the store as a watchman, took dinner with Pa one day, and he begged so hard to have his meals at our place instead of that crowded cook shanty that Ma took him to board. Fred was Big Jerry's brother-in-law, and Big Jerry came with Fred to dinner. After that, whenever he was in our camp, he ate with Pa and Fred. The company men, when passing through, came too, so Ma and I were very busy. Big Jerry never stayed long in one camp, but at any time might ride up on his white horse, always bar-headed and wearing a flaming red shirt. He would work a few days, long enough to win the men's money gambling at night in the bunkhouse, and then ride away to another camp where he would do the same thing. He was a good worker when he did work, and very kind to anyone in trouble. There was a rumor that he was a lookout for a gang of horse thieves operating along the line. One thing was certain: no horses were ever stolen where Jerry was in the camp. It was thought that while he was working, he had a chance to see which horses were the best and the place where they stood at night in the long shanty stable, so that it was easier for someone to come in the dark and get a good horse instead of a poor one. Cherry had been seen looking them over as he stood in their stalls, and the men had become suspicious of him. One night a warning came to camp to watch the horses. The men came to the store and brought extra cartridges for their guns and lay around in the dark all night watching the stable, but no one came. They thought that they would catch Big Jerry and swore that someone must have warned him. The next day we learned that 2 horses had been stolen from the camp west of us. We were glad nothing happened to Jerry. We all liked him. He was so quiet and nice around our shanty, so kind-hearted. There was in camp a funny little old Irishman named Johnny. All his life he had lived and worked in railroad camps, but was now so old that he couldn't work any more. He had no money, so Pa made him a water boss and paid him regular wages. He had a wooden yoke that rested on his shoulders and carried a bucket of water with a dipper hanging by a chain from each end. As he walked up and down and around among the men, steadying the buckets with his hands, they helped themselves to drink whenever they wanted one. One night Johnny was taken sick, and Jerry waited on him most of the night, taking the blankets from his own bunk and put over Johnny to make him warmer, for it was cold at night, and poor old Johnny needed more covers. In the morning, Jerry came to our shanty and asked for some of Ma's good warm breakfast for Johnny. He took it to Johnny and waited on him while he ate, before he had his own breakfast. But every man in camp except old Johnny, Pa, and Fred were afraid of Jerry, for he was a terrible fighter with his fists and feet, a dead shot with his gun. It was because of a fight that Jerry came to our shanty for the first time. Looking out of our door towards the cook shanty, where the men had just gone in for dinner, I saw them come piling out so fast they could hardly get through the door. They spread out into a great ring with Jerry and a big Irishman in the corner. The two began walking around each other, and I said, "Something is wrong down there." Pa and Fred were just sitting down in the table, but they came to the door to look. Fred examined that damned fool. Jerry will kill him. And with a flying leap through the door, he was running as fast as he could to go toward the crowd. Fred was a small man, almost as small as old Johnny, and when he broke through the ring of men, jumped between Jerry and the big Irishman, and faced Jerry, taking a fiercely and just gesticulating, he reminded me of bantam rooster. Pa watched and laughed. When Ma looked her astonishment, he said, "Oh, Fred will manage Jerry." And sure enough, in a few minutes, Fred came back to his dinner, bringing Jerry, grinning sheepishly with him, and asked Ma to put on another plate. Then, next excitement in camp after watching for the horse thieves was a prairie fire that came sweeping out the west after dark and got into the tall grass and in the big slough. It looked for a while as though hold on, did it? I think it actually. I think it skipped. Hold on. Oh, there we go. It looked for a while as though the camp would be burned, for the men were all out with teams plowing furrows to turn the fire and settling backfires, whipping them out on the side next to the camp, while they were small and whipping out little fires with grain sacks. They headed around the camp, and it went roaring around the other side of the lake and away to the east. Then the men became restless and unruly. Some of them wanted to quit the job, and they decided they would not wait for payday, but insisted that Pa pay them at once and up to date. Payday was the 15th of each month, and all the day they were paid up to the 1st, leaving them always 15 days behind in their pay. And this was their excuse for making trouble. But Pa could not pay them until the money come from the company headquarters. He told us at supper that he must stay at the store that night to keep the men from breaking in and wrecking it. Fred was away for a few days. Pa went back to the store, and in the darkness, the men began to gather in groups and go toward it until all 200 men in the camp were in the crowd before the door. Then they began to shoot off their guns and call Pa names, daring him to come out. Ma and I were watching through the partially open door, and I was shaking, not with fear, but with rage. Pa's alone, I said. I'm not going to help him. But Ma held me and said, no, be still. I would only make it worse if I went out there. Then the store door opened and closed behind Pa, and he stood out on the step with his hands in his pockets talking to the men. 2 or 3 of the men started to talk ugly, but the others were quiet while Pa told them how foolish they were, for he couldn't pay them when the money was not there. That he had always treated them right and would pay them as soon as he could. That if they shot him and wrecked the store, still wouldn't have their pay, but would be in trouble. Finally, the men began to go away one at a time, then several together until they were all gone. Then Pa locked the store door and came home. The gunshots, the shouts, and the loud talking had not been the worst of the affair, but the low, ugly muttering I had heard as sort of undertone, and now it was all over. I sat on the edge of my bed, shivering with fright long after I should have been asleep. The days passed by while the weather grew colder, and there was frost in the night. The railroad grade was nearly finished. The ground had been broken with big plows drawn by great horse teams all the way where the grade stakes were set. Then the teams on the scrapers scraped the dirt up into the grade on which ties could be placed and the steel rails laid. Where there was a low place in the ground, the grade was raised higher, making a fill. Where the ground was too high, the roadway was cut through so the grade was nearly level all the way. All the grading must be finished before the winter to be ready for laying of the tracks in the spring. So Pa and Uncle Hi were hurrying the work all the way they could. But the men were dragging. The weather was unpleasant, with the cold wind blowing all the times, and there was feeling of coming winter in the air. Added to the discomfort of the dust from the grade, as the teams and the men worked in the dirt, it made the men disheartened and rather uncertain in temper. The company had put new men on the work. He was a timekeeper over several camps, riding from one to the other down the line, one day, then the back, then the next day, so that he visited each camp of his string every day, docking the men if they were a few minutes late, spying and prying to be sure that no one got credit for a half day he didn't work. Naturally, the men disliked him, and more became. He was a townman, very well dressed, wearing his white shirt and collar and tie. He made our camp before noon and stopped for dinner at our place, but unpleasantly, as though he thought himself above the fare and placed all the people. Our men were working on the big fill, scraping the dirt from the nearby high place, loading it on the wagons at the dump, hauling it to the fill, unloading and coming back for more. The dump was cut in the high ground, just wide enough to drive the teams and wagons through. Planks were laid across, leaving a hole in the middle. A team with a scraper full of dirt was driven over the planks, while the driver tipped the scraper, spilling the dirt through the hole into the wagon just beneath. When 5 scraper loads had been emptied, the wagon was driven onto the film, making room for the next wagon to be loaded. The new timekeeper had been making his rounds for some time before Jerry to camp. Then he rode up on his white horse while the timekeeper was checking the men at the dump. Jerry sat on his horse and listened for a few minutes, then reached and taking the timekeeper's horse by the bridle, led him through the dump between the wagons so that he received the scraperful of dirt in place of the wagon it was intended for. At the other side of the timekeeper tried to escape, but Jerry wheeled his horse and took him back through it in time for the next scraper. 3 times he led him through the dump, and 3 scraper loads of dirt and dust spilled down over the good clothes, the once white shirt and collar, while the men, all but Jerry, were laughing. Then he let him go. The timekeeper did not stop for dinner, and he never came back. We beard later that he rode east to. Tracy took the train and went still further east, shaking the dust of the West from his shoes and from all the rest of his clothes. But the big laugh did the men good. They laughed about it for days and put themselves in good humor so that the work went merrily on. Shortly after this, there was trouble at camp. Further west, where the paymaster had headquarters at the big company store. The 300 men in camp did not want to wait until the 15th for their pay. They thought that 5 days was long enough for the payment to figure their time. So on the 6th, they stopped work and demanded their pay. The paymaster refused to pay until the 15th. After some drinking and arguing, the men decided they would be paid at once and up to date for the month and 5 days. The men were quarrelsome, and one of the teamsters had some difficulty with the man who weighed in the oats he had hauled for the company store. The weigher hit the teamster on the head with one of the heavy weights from the scales. The teamster dropped, and the men thought he was killed. The weigher barely got inside the store ahead of the mob, dodged through the crowd in the store and out the back door and into the tall grass of the big slough that came close to the door. While the friends of the teamster were hunting for him in the crowd, a friend of his led the 2 horses into the slough. The weigher mounted, and they too followed the slough for some distance before they were seen. Then the mob gave chase, but being drunk and so far behind, they soon gave up. In the store were 2 clerks and another weigher. The crowd of men went through the store from the front door to the back and in as they pleased with all their guns and their threats. They could not compel the clerks to hand out the goods to them, and something kept them from helping themselves. A half-drunken big workman would allow his gun down on a clerk and tell him to hand him some of the goods, and the clerk would stand leaning back against the shelf and laugh and talk him into being good-natured. It was a good-natured crowd, even when ugly so far as the store was concerned. But the paymaster was something else. The paymaster's office was a lento at the side of the store. He was in there with both doors locked, and their pay was in there too. At last, 2 men climbed on the roof, cut a hole through, and dropped a rope down while the others of the crowd were breaking down the door.
They intended to put the rope around the paymaster's neck, haul him up to hang from the roof while they helped themselves. But when he saw the door splintering, he threw open the pay window and said he would pay, which he did, and without being too particular as to half days' time, as they were paid, the men went away. Men from other camps went home, and all was peaceful again. In the morning early, our men had followed. Big Jerry, as he leaped on the white horse and shouted, "Come on, boys!" They went as fast as they could, but no horse up or down the line could keep up with Jerry's white pony. Now they came staggering back after night, tired but still hilarious. Soon afterward, the men began to leave our camp, for work was nearly finished and many men were not needed. So singly in or singly or in groups, in wagons and on horseback, they drove or rode away. One Irish family, ready to leave, had a sick baby and could not go. Ma heard of it and went to see if she could help. By great good luck, she did know what to do and cured the baby. They wanted to pay her, but of course she wouldn't take no pay. The morning they left, the man come to bid her goodbye and thank her again. He called on every saint in the Irish calendar to bless her, and when she shook hands, he hurried away and left a $5 gold piece in her hand. Louisa and Charlie were gone long since. Andocia loaded her 3 big wagons from their shanty and the company store, and herself driving one. Lena and Jean, the other 2, left for her contract on the railroad farther south. Uncle Hi came to board with us until he could make settlement with the railroad company. He was good in spirits, for on this contract, through farther behind than before on the books, he had come out ahead. The contractor did not have capital to finance the building operations, so the railroad company paid the men furnished. The goods in the company's store and grain for the teams. Everything used on the job was charged against the contractor. The men paid out their wages, for they used personally, and the final settlement, the contractor's profit, was what was left over and above the expenses. The contractor did not draw pay for his own teams. On the face of it would be simply paying it himself, but this time Uncle Hi, 3 teams had been put on the work in Pa's name, and Uncle Hi had the pay for them. He had drawn supplies through the company store, and of grain for the horses' feed he had his right to do, and he had quietly sent them away by trusted teamsters and sold them, keeping the pay, so that while on the books he was a great deal more than bankrupt. He made what he had lost, for there was no way the company could collect what he owed except on another contract that Uncle Hi said. There was plenty of work on other railroads. This making money by losing it was something new to me, but he was curiously satisfying to know that Uncle Hi had beaten the Chicago Northwestern Railroad and its own game, and made enough to give him profit on both contracts. In the few days, he made his final settlement and followed Aunt Docia, giving Mary a handful of bills as she sat in her big rocking chair when she said goodbye. Ma and I had been so hurried with the work, cooking for extra men as the camp broke up, we had no time for sewing, and alas, my dresses wore out until I had no change. Mary had been wearing long dresses and was taller than I, but she had an extra dress. I put it on. Then I pinned up my hair because my long braids hanging got in my way and hindered the work. So there I was, young lady with long dresses and hair done up. I was lonesome after Lena had gone, and I didn't feel like singing when I milked the cow The cow was uneasy, and I would not stand still, and Ma complained about my not getting as much milk as I should. Then, having a thought, I tried to experiment and learned that when I sang at my milking, I got quantity of milk, but when I did not sing, the cow would not give her milk down. 50 years ago, I learned this, and just 50 years ago, I learned this, and just this winter, an experiment station discovered with surprise that cows like music and that the flow of milk is increased by playing the radio while milking. When the work stopped, Pa was free to hunt and had been longing to do, and the camp became quieter, the weather colder, sending them south. Silver Lake and the air above it were full of all the migratory birds. Gulls flew against the wind over the lake in clouds. The big gray geese honked and swam and flew. Ducks were in the water, going and coming in countless numbers. Flocks of beautiful white swans floated on the water. Pelicans filled their pouches with little fish and went their way southward. Sandhill cranes lighted on rises of grounds where they could watch around them, and antelope herds could sometimes be seen feeding on the prairie. So Pa went to his hunting, and we feasted on geese and duck. Ma and I saved all the feathers, and that fall we made a large feather bed and 4 large pillows from the best of the feathers. When I was married, Ma gave me 2 of these pillows, and they are good yet, as soft as the newly bought ones. Pelicans we could not use, for they smelled so strong of rotten fish in the pouch that even the feathers stank. Pa shot one swan that measured 7 feet from tip to tip of its wings. He skinned it carefully, salted the flesh side of this, and sent it to Uncle Tom to have it tanned to make a swan's down coat for his baby Helen. There was only a few men left in camp. Now we were feeding them, for there was no other place to eat. The R&R surveyors were still in the house that had been built for them at the head of the lake, but they were going soon, and we were moving to the R&R company. R&R company had hired Paul to stay through the winter and take care of the house and tools that would be left there until work began again in the spring. I'm going to stop here, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to break this up into 2 sections.